Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something that is arguably the most valuable digital asset in any company, but also paradoxically, often the absolute softest target. We are talking about the crown jewels.
The crown jewels. It sounds pretty dramatic, doesn't it? Like we're planning a casino heist.
It really does. But I mean, when you strip away the metaphor,
Mm-hmm.
in the digital world, the crown jewels are almost always sitting inside a Microsoft SQL server. That is where your customer records are, your credentials, financial data, intellectual property. It's the vault.
It's the central nervous system of data for most enterprises. And because it holds everything valuable, it is naturally the primary target for attackers. I mean, if you control the SQL server, you essentially control the business.
Right. And that brings us to the core problem, and really the whole reason we are doing this specific deep dive today.
Hmm.
Despite being the biggest target, these servers are often described as the soft underbelly of an infrastructure. You would think the vault would be the hardest thing to crack.
You would think so.
But the reality is often the exact opposite. Why is that?
It's a combination of fear and functionality, really. You have these servers running with very high privileges. They can do a lot of things on the network, and they have direct access to that sensitive data we just mentioned. But historically, they suffer from really weak hardening practices.
Because people are scared to touch them.
Exactly. People spin them up, they get the application working, and then they're just terrified to touch the security settings.
The classic, if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality. Even if not broke actually means wide open to anyone with a little bit of know-how.
That is the prevailing mindset, yeah. Security is often seen as friction.
So to navigate this, we are digging into a very specific high-fidelity source today. We are looking at the Microsoft SQL Server 2019 and 2022 Secure Deployment and Hardening Guide. This was published by SOCFortress in February 2026, and we're specifically looking at their breakdown of the CIS benchmarks.
Which is huge. For those who aren't deep in the compliance weeds, the CIS benchmarks from the Center for Internet Security, those are the gold standard.
They aren't just one person's opinion.
No, not at all. They are consensus-based best practices. And the mission here, as outlined by SOCFortress, isn't just to make the server work. It's to make it resilient against compromise, lateral movement, data exfiltration, and doing all of that without breaking the business.
That's the balance we want to find. So let's unpack this. I want to start with the scary stuff right off the bat, the threat landscape. How are these servers actually getting compromised? Because I assume in 2026 it's more sophisticated than just someone guessing a password or running a basic SQL injection script.
Oh, it is much more evolved. The threat model is multi-layered now. I mean, yes, you have the classic SQL injection from web applications where an attacker tricks the database into revealing info. That hasn't completely gone away.
Sure.
But we are seeing a massive shift toward credential theft, particularly involving service accounts and something called lateral movement.
Lateral movement, that's a term we hear a lot in these deep dives. That's essentially the attacker hopping from one compromised server to another.
Right. Right. Think of it this way. An attacker might compromise a web server first because it faces the internet. It's exposed. But the web server isn't the actual goal. The database is.
But the web server has to talk to the database.
Exactly. The web server must talk to the database to function. So the attacker uses that existing trust relationship to move laterally from the web server into the SQL server. They are basically using your own architecture against you.
So once they're in, whether they came through the front door or the side door via the web server, what are they looking for? Obviously, they want the data.
They want to dump sensitive data, of course. But sophisticated attackers want more than just a data dump. They want to achieve OS command execution.
OS command execution. So moving from just querying the database software to actually controlling the underlying Windows operating system.
That is the holy grail for an attacker. If they get that, they own the box. And that brings us to what I like to call the God mode features.
God mode. I really like that description. So let's talk about surface area reduction. The source calls this the low-hanging fruit, which implies it should be easy to fix, yet it often isn't.
The concept is incredibly simple. If you don't need a feature, turn it off. It minimizes the attack surface. And the biggest villain here, the one that makes security experts actively lose sleep, is a feature called XPCMD shell.
XBCMD shell. It literally sounds like a command from the Windows 95 days.
It is a legacy feature, but it is identified as CIS Control 2.6, and it is marked as a critical severity item.
Okay, so let's get technical for a second. What does XPCMD shell actually do that makes it so wildly dangerous?
It allows the SQL Server to spawn a Windows command shell and execute operating system commands. It directly bridges the gap between the database engine and the Windows OS.
Wait, so if I'm an attacker and I have SQL access, maybe I just have the ability to run a basic query and this feature is turned on.
Yeah.
I can just run Windows commands.
Yes. You can create new users on the server, you can download malware from the internet, you can browse the file system on the C drive. I mean, if an attacker gets access to XPCMD shell, the game is essentially over. They have full OS compromise.
That seems completely insane that it would even be an option in modern software. Why is it even still there?
It's there for legacy administrative reasons. Sometimes database administrators use it to move files around or trigger scripts, but the SOCFortress guide is crystal clear on this. Disable it.
Just turn it off.
Turn it off. If you aren't using it for a very specific, heavily controlled reason, it needs to be off. Leaving it on is like leaving a loaded gun on the table.
Are there other God mode features we should be worried about?
There are a few. CIS 2.2 covers CLR integration. CLR stands for Common Language Runtime. It essentially allows you to run compiled .NET code directly inside the database engine.
Which sounds super useful for developers who want to do complex logic.
It is useful, but attackers love it because they can use it for memory injection. They can execute malicious code directly in the SQL Server's memory space.
What?
It's also great for maintaining persistence, meaning they can hide their malware inside the SQL service itself, so it just restarts whenever the server restarts.
So it's a hiding spot and a weapon all at once.
Exactly. And then you have OLE automation and ad hoc distributed queries. These allow the SQL Server to talk to other data sources, like Excel files or completely different servers on the network.
That sounds a lot like what security researchers call living off the land.
That is exactly what it is. Living off the land means the attacker doesn't need to upload their own custom hacking tools. They just use the features Microsoft already built into the product. Why trigger an antivirus alert by bringing in malware when you can just use OLE automation to read the file system natively?
So the takeaway for surface area reduction is basically binary. Turn these off immediately.
Correct. Unless you have a signed note from your CTO explaining exactly why you need them, they should be disabled.
Okay, let's move to session 2 of the deep dive. We've locked down the features. Now we need to talk about who is actually allowed in. The identity crisis.
This is where we see a lot of confusion and, frankly, a lot of laziness in configuration. The source focuses heavily on authentication and authorization.
And the big debate here, Windows authentication versus SQL authentication. This is CIS 3.1. I feel like this argument has been going on for 20 years in IT departments.
Yeah.
What is the final verdict?
The verdict from SOCFortress and the CIS benchmarks is incredibly clear. You must use Windows integrated authentication whenever possible.
For the benefit of our listeners who might not be dedicated database administrators, why is SQL authentication so bad? That's where you just create a user inside SQL with a password, right?
Correct. The core problem is that with SQL authentication, the password hashes are stored locally on the SQL Server itself. If an attacker manages to dump those hashes, they can take them offline and crack them at their own pace.
And I assume it doesn't play nice with the rest of the corporate network security either.
It plays by its own rules, which is exactly the problem. SQL Auth completely bypasses all the protections you have set up in Active Directory. You might have a global policy that says lock out accounts after 3 failed attempts, or require multi-factor authentication. SQL Auth usually ignores all of that.
So it's kind of like having a high-tech security system for your house cameras, biometrics, the works, which is Windows Auth, but then the back door just has a separate flimsy padlock with the key hidden under the mat, and that's SQL Auth.
That is a perfect analogy. Windows authentication leverages your main robust security system, Kerberos, Active Directory. It is much safer, and crucially, it's centrally managed.
Now let's talk about power, the sysadmin role.
Ah, yes. CIS 4.1. Being a sysadmin in SQL Server is effectively being god of that box. You have full control over the database and, usually, the underlying OS via those features we just discussed.
The source mentions a very specific, extremely common mistake regarding who automatically gets to be a sysadmin. It involves a group called BLT and administrators.
Right, CIS 3.5. This is a legacy setting that persists in so many environments. Essentially, it means that anyone who is a local administrator on the Windows server automatically gets full sysadmin rights inside the SQL server.
So if I'm just an IT support guy who has admin rights to maybe patch the Windows server, or maybe I'm the backup guy,
Yeah,
I accidentally have full control over the most sensitive banking data in the entire company.
exactly. And you probably don't even know you have it. It violates the principle of least privilege completely. Database administration and server administration are entirely different roles. They shouldn't overlap by default. You absolutely need to remove that group from the sysadmin role.
That seems like a massive oversight that is so easy to fix. And speaking of overlapping roles, what about the service accounts? The actual user account that the SQL software itself runs as.
This is CIS 8.1, and it's a disaster waiting to happen in many, many environments. People often run the SQL service as local system, or even worse, a domain admin account.
Why do they do that? That sounds crazy.
Because it's easy. If you run as a domain admin, the SQL server has permission to touch absolutely everything on the network. You never get a permission denied error when trying to write a backup to a remote file share. It fixes the operational friction instantly.
But if the SQL server gets compromised, and it's running as a domain admin,
Then the attacker becomes that user. If SQL is running as a domain admin and I compromise SQL via an injection flaw, I am now a domain admin. I don't just own the database. I own the entire corporate network. I can create users. I can reset the CEO's password, everything.
so the advice is to use dedicated, low-privileged service accounts.
Yes. Managed service accounts, or GMSAs, are the gold standard here. They handle their own password rotation automatically, and they should only have permission to do exactly what SQL needs to function, and absolutely nothing more.
Okay, so we've reduced the surface area, and we've fixed the identity issues. Now I want to shift to what the outline calls the silent killers. These are the things that aren't necessarily features you can just flip a switch on, but rather processes you ignore at your own peril.
Right. We are talking about auditing, backups, and patching, the unsexy parts of security.
Let's start with patching, CIS 1.1. I mean, we all know we should patch. Why is this a deep dive topic?
Because in the SQL world, patching is psychological warfare. Operational teams are often legitimately scared of cluster stability concerns.
Oh, right.
Terrified. They worry that if they apply a cumulative update, the database simply won't come back up, or the high availability cluster will fail over unexpectedly in the middle of the day. So you see massive organizations running years behind on their patches.
And what is the actual risk there? Is it just bugs and performance glitches?
No, it's RCE, remote code execution. Unpatched servers are a primary vector for RCE exploits. If you are years behind, you are sitting on known vulnerabilities that automated exploit kits are already scanning the internet for.
So you're trading a potential stability headache for a guaranteed security hole.
That's the trade-off, and it's a losing bet every single time.
Then there is the invisible crime, auditing, CIS 6.1 and 6.2.
This is one of those things where you don't know what you don't know. If you don't enable auditing for failed logins or role changes, you literally won't know you've been breached until the data is already for sale on the dark web.
The source had a really startling point about this.
Yes, it noted that a lack of auditing leads to undetected compromised windows measured in months. Imagine an attacker living inside your server for 6 months, looking around, running queries, mapping your network, and you have 0 logs to prove they were ever there.
That is terrifying. But here is the one that really flipped my perspective when I was reading the source. The backup trap, CIS 7.1. I always thought backups were the good guys. They save you from ransomware.
They save you from data loss, absolutely. But if handled poorly, they are the primary vehicle for data theft.
Explain that mechanism for us. How does a backup become a threat?
Think about what a backup actually is. It's a .back file. It is a complete bit-by-bit copy of your entire database. If an attacker can get into the file system, maybe via that XPC MD shell we talked about earlier, they don't need to actively query the database to steal your data. They don't need to run a million select statements that might trigger a monitoring alarm. They just copy the .back file.
So they just steal the whole container.
Exactly. They copy it to a USB drive, or they upload it to a random cloud storage bucket. Then they take it offline. They restore it on their own laptop, on their own personal instance of SQL Server.
And once it's on their laptop,
Your firewalls don't matter anymore. Your auditing doesn't matter. They can browse the data at their complete leisure. They can run heavy password cracking tools against the hashes without impacting your server's performance. They basically have the safe sitting in their garage.
wow. That completely bypasses all the network security we spend millions of dollars on. So what is the fix here?
CIS 7.1 is critical here. Encrypt the backups.
Encrypting the file itself.
Yes. If you use transparent data encryption, or TDE, or native backup encryption, that .back file becomes entirely unreadable without the corresponding certificate.
Mhm.
If they steal an encrypted backup, it is just digital garbage to them.
That seems incredibly important, yet I feel like it's often skipped.
It is, usually because of performance fears, which really brings us to the tension between operational reality and security.
Section 4. Because we know the database administrators are listening to this right now and screaming at their speakers, you'll break my app or you'll nuke my performance.
And we really have to validate that. Security controls cannot break the business logic. If the app stops working, security has failed just as much as if it were breached.
Let's talk about high availability. Remember, always on groups. The source mentions that patching these is highly complex.
It is. You can't just patch willy-nilly. There is a very specific order of operations you have to follow. You have to patch the secondary replica, the backup node first. Then you fail over the operations to that newly patched node. Only then do you patch the former primary.
It sounds like a delicate dance. What happens if you miss a step?
If you leave even one replica unpatched, the source says the entire availability group is vulnerable. It's a chain, and it's only as strong as the weakest link.
And interestingly, the source notes that attackers actually target the secondary replicas specifically.
Yes, that is a classic tactic. People often forget to monitor the secondary nodes. They focus all their security tools, all their eyes on glass on the primary node because that's where the active users are. But the secondary node has the exact same sensitive data. It's often less monitored and sometimes has weaker local permissions. It is a massive backdoor into the cluster.
Now, what about those legacy applications? You mentioned earlier that some apps effectively break if you turn off XPCMD shell or CLR. What if the business comes to you and says, we absolutely need this old app to run, and it fundamentally requires XPCMD shell?
This is where formal risk management comes in. You can't just say no, but you also can't just say yes. The source advises a compromise here. If you must use those dangerous features, you have to treat that server as high-risk Tier 0 infrastructure.
Tier 0, meaning the highest possible level of security.
Right. You isolate it completely. You firewall it off so only the specific application server can talk to it. You do not put it on the general corporate network. You accept the risk, but you heavily contain the blast radius.
Got it. Now let's bust some myths. Performance. I feel like every DBA has used performance as an excuse to not turn on encryption.
It is the ultimate trump card. They always say TDE will slow down my queries.
What does the data actually say about that?
The SOCFortress guide confirms that on modern systems, we're talking SQL 2019 and 2022, TDE only adds about 3 to 5% I/O overhead.
3 to 5%. That seems totally negligible for most use cases.
It really is, and it has virtually zero CPU impact because modern processors have dedicated instruction sets, AES-NI, built specifically just for handling encryption. Unless you're running a high-frequency stock trading platform where every single microsecond counts, you simply won't notice it.
And what about TLS? Encrypting the connection itself between the app and the database.
Minimal impact. But it is absolutely critical for CIS 5.1. Without TLS, anyone with a network sniffer can see your data and your credentials flying across the wire in plain text. It is just not worth the risk to leave it disabled.
So the excuse of it's too slow just doesn't hold water anymore.
Not with modern hardware and modern SQL versions. No, it doesn't.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground today. We've looked at the threat landscape, the identity issues, the silent killers like unencrypted backups, and the operational realities.
It's a lot to digest, but it is vital for anyone managing these systems.
Let's recap the big takeaways before we sign off. If our listener is going to do 3 things tomorrow morning to their SQL environment, what should they be?
First, surface area reduction. Go check if XPCMD shell is enabled right now. If it is, and you don't explicitly know why, turn it off. That is a critical vulnerability that bridges the database directly to the OS.
Check. Number 2.
Identity. Make sure you aren't using mixed mode authentication if you don't absolutely have to. Stick to Windows authentication. And crucially, get those local administrators out of the sysadmin role. Remove the Build to Cordia and administrators group today.
And number 3.
Encrypt your backups. Do not let your data sit in a clear text file that can be copied to a thumb drive and just walked out the front door.
Simple, actionable steps.
Yeah.
But here's the thing about security. It's never really done, is it?
No, it never is, and that's the one big thing to remember here. Security controls should only be relaxed with formal risk acceptance. Don't just leave things open for convenience's sake. Every open port or enabled legacy feature is a choice you are making to accept risk on behalf of the company. Make sure it's a conscious choice.
Now, I want to leave our listeners with that provocative thought you mentioned to me earlier. We talked about backups being stolen.
Yes. This is something that really stuck with me from the SOCFortress material. We often worry so much about the breach happening today. We watch the live logs for today. But one of the most common causes of silent historical data breaches is stolen, unencrypted backups.
Silent historical data breaches. That sounds incredibly ominous.
Think about it. You might secure your server today, you patch it up, you lock down the features, but if an attacker managed to steal an unencrypted backup file 3 years ago, they still have that data.
Whoa. So the server is totally secure right now, but the data has been gone for years.
Exactly. They could literally be restoring that database on a laptop right now. Your customer's data from 2023. You wouldn't know. You wouldn't see a login attempt. It's just gone.
That is a genuinely chilling thought. You can patch a server, but you can't patch a file that's already left the building.
Exactly. And that is why encryption matters so much. It protects the data even after it leaves your physical control.
Well, on that slightly terrifying note, we are going to wrap up this deep dive. A huge thank you to SOCFortress for the breakdown and the deep dive into the CIS benchmarks data.
Indeed. It's a fantastic resource for anyone running these systems.
Keep those databases locked down, everyone. We will see you next time.
Stay secure.